This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 2, Chapters 13 through 19.
Part 2, Chapter 13. At a place called the Pont de Nieppe, beyond Armentières, a most unhealthy place in later years of war, a bathing establishment was organized by officers who were as proud of their work as though they had brought a piece of paradise to Flanders. To be fair to them, they had done that. To any interested visitor, understanding the nobility of their work, they exhibited a curious relic. It was the holy shirt of Nieppe, which should be treasured as a memorial in our war museum and object lesson of what the Great War meant to clean living men. It was not a saint's shirt, but had been worn by a British officer in the trenches, and was like tens of thousands of other shirts worn by our officers and men in the first winters of the war, neither better nor worse, but a fair average specimen. It had been framed in a glass case, and revealed, on its linen, the corpses of thousands of lice. That vermin swarmed upon the bodies of all our boys who went into the trenches and tortured them. After 3 days they were lousy from head to foot. After 3 weeks they were walking menageries. To English boys from clean homes, to young officers who had been brought up in the religion of the morning tub, this was one of the worst horrors of war. They were disgusted with themselves. Their own bodies were revolting to them. Scores of times I have seen battalions of men just out of battle stripping themselves and hunting in their shirts for the foul beast. They had a technical name for this hunter's job. They called it chatting. They desired a bath, as the hart panteth for the water brooks, and baths were but a mirage of the brain to men in Flanders fields and beyond the Somme, until here and there, as at Nieppe, officers with human sympathy organized a system by which battalions of men could wash their bodies. The place in Nieppe had been a jute factory, and there were big tubs in the sheds, and nearby was the water of the Liz. Boilers were set going to heat the water. A battalion's shirts were put into an oven, and the lice were baked and killed. It was a splendid thing to see scores of boys wallowing in those big tubs, 6 in a tub, with a bit of soap for each. They gave little grunts and shouts of joyous satisfaction. The cleansing water, the liquid heat, made their flesh tingle with exquisite delight, sensuous and spiritual. They were like children. They splashed one another with gurgles of laughter. They put their heads under water and came up puffing and blowing like grampuses. Something broke in one's heart to see them, those splendid boys whose bodies might soon be torn to tatters by chunks of steel. One of them remembered a bit of Latin he had sung at Stonyhurst. Asperges me domine hyssopo, edmundaba, lavabis me, et super nivum dealbaba. Thou shalt sprinkle me with hyssop, O Lord, and I shall be cleansed. Thou shalt wash me, and I shall be made whiter than snow. On the other side of the lines the Germans were suffering in the same way, lousy also, and they too were organizing bathhouses. After their first retreat I saw a queer name on a wooden shed, Entlausenanstalt. I puzzled over it a moment, and then understood. It was a new word created out of the dirt of modern war delicing station. Part 2, Chapter 14. It was harvest time in the summer of 15, and Death was not the only reaper who went about the fields, although he was busy and did not rest even when the sun had flamed down below the belt of trees on the far ridge and left the world in darkness. On a night in August 2 of us stood in a cornfield silent under the great dome, staring up at the startling splendor of it. The red ball just showed above the far line of single trees which were black as charcoal on the edge of a long, straight road 2 miles away, and from its furnace there were flung 1,000,000 feathers of flame against the silk blue canopy of the evening sky. The burning colors died out in a few minutes, and the fields darkened, and all the corn shocks paled until they became quite white, like rows of tents under the harvest moon. Another night had come in this year of war. Up Ypres way the guns were busy, and at regular intervals the earth trembled and the air vibrated with dull, thunderous shocks. "The moon's face looks full of irony tonight," said the man by my side. "It seems to say, what fools those creatures are down there, spoiling their harvest time with such a mess of blood." The stars were very bright in some of those Flemish nights. I saw the Milky Way clearly tracked across the dark desert. The Pleiades and Orion's belt were like diamonds on black velvet. But among all these worlds of light other stars, unknown to astronomers, appeared and disappeared. On the road back from a French town one night I looked Arras way and saw what seemed a bursting planet. It fell with a scatter of burning pieces. Then suddenly the thick cloth of the night was rent with stabs of light, as though flashing swords were hacking it, and a moment later A finger of white fire was traced along the black edge of the far-off woods, so that the whole sky was brightened for a moment, and then was blotted out by a deeper darkness. Arras was being shelled again, as I saw it many times in those long years of war. The darkness of all the towns in the war zone was rather horrible. Their strange, intense quietude, when the guns were not at work, made them dead, as the very spirit of a town dies on the edge of war. One night, as on many others, I walked through one of them with a friend. Every house was shuttered, and hardly a gleam came through any crack. No footstep, save our own, told of life. The darkness was almost palpable. It seemed to press against one's eyeballs like a velvet mask. My nerves were so on edge with a sense of the uncanny silence and invisibility that I started violently at the sound of a quiet voice speaking 3 inches from my ear. Halte. Qui va là? It was a French sentry who stood with his back to the wall of a house in such a gulf of blackness that not even his bayonet was revealed by a glint. Another day of war came. The old beauty of the world was there, close to the lines of the bronzed cornfields splashed with the scarlet of poppies, and the pale yellow of the newly cut sheaves, stretching away and away, without the break of a hedge, to the last slopes which met the sky. I stood in some of those harvest fields, staring across to a slope of rising ground, where there was no ripening wheat, and where the grass itself came to a sudden halt, as though afraid of something. I knew the reason of this, and of the long white lines of earth thrown up for miles each way. Those were the parapets of German trenches, and in the ditches below them were earth-men, armed with deadly weapons, staring out across the beauty of France and wondering, perhaps, why they should be there to mar it, and watching me, a little black dot in their range of vision, with an idle thought as to whether it were worth their while to let a bullet loose and end my walk. They could have done so easily, but did not bother. No shot or shell came to break through the hum of bees, or to crash through the sigh of the wind, which was bending all the ears of corn to listen to the murmurous insect life in these fields of France. Close to me was a group of peasants a study for a painter like Millet. One of them shouted out to me, "Voilà les boches," waving his arm to left and right, and then shaking a clenched fist at them. A sturdy girl with a brown throat showing through an open bodice munched an apple, like Audrey in As You Like It, and between her bites told me that she had had a brother killed in the war, and that she had been nearly killed herself, a week ago, by shells that came bursting all round her as she was tying up her sheaves. She pointed to great holes in the field, and described the coming of the Germans into her village over there, when she had lied to some Uhlans about the whereabouts of French soldiers, and had given one of those fat Germans a blow on the face when he had tried to make love to Mate Mai in her father's barn. Her mother had been raped. In further fields out of view of the German trenches, but well within shell range, the harvesting was being done by French soldiers. One of them was driving the reaping machine and looked like a gunner on his limber, with his kepi thrust to the back of his head. The trousers of his comrades were as red as the poppies that grew on the edge of the wheat, and 3 of these poilus had ceased their work to drink out of a leather wine bottle which had been replenished from a hand cart. It was a pretty scene if one could forget the grim purpose which had put those harvesters in uniform. The same thought was in the mind of a British officer. "A beautiful country this," he said. "It's a pity to cut it up with trenches and barbed wire." Battalions of new army men were being reviewed, but a furlong or 2 away from that invisible man who was wielding a scythe which had no mercy for unripe wheat. Out of those lines of eyes stared the courage of men's souls, not shirking the next ordeal. It was through red ears of corn, in that summer of 15, that one found one's way to many of the trenches that marked the boundary lines of the year's harvesting, and in Belgium, by Kemmel Hill, the shells of our batteries, answered by German guns, came with their long-drawn howls of murder across the heads of peasant women who were gleaning, with bent backs. In Plug Street Wood the trees had worn thin under showers of shrapnel, but the long avenues between the trenches were cool and pleasant in the heat of the day. It was one of the elementary schools where many of our soldiers learned the ABC of actual warfare after their training in camps behind the lines. Here one might sport with amaryllis in the shade, but for the fact that country wenches were not allowed in the dugouts and trenches, where I found our soldiers killing flies in the intervals between pot shots at German periscopes. The enemy was engaged, presumably, in the same pursuit of killing time and life, with luck, and sniping was hot on both sides, so that the wood resounded with sharp reports, as though hard filbert nuts were being cracked by giant teeth. Each time I went there one of our men was hit by a sniper, and his body was carried off for burial as I went toward the first line of trenches, hoping that my shadow would not fall across a German periscope. The sight of that dead body passing chilled one a little. There were many graves in the bosky arbors, 18 under one mound, but some of those who had fallen 6 months before still lay where the gleaners could not reach them. I used to peer through the leaves of Plug Street Wood at no man's land between the lines, where every creature had been killed by the sweeping flail of machine guns and shrapnel. Along the harvest fields there were many barren territories like that, and up by Hooge, along the edge of the fatal crater, and behind the stripped trees of Zuev Wood, there was no other gleaning to be had but that of broken shells and shrapnel bullets, and a litter of limbs. Part 2. Chapter 15. For some time the War Office would not allow military bands at the front, not understanding that music was like water to parched souls. By degrees divisional generals realized the utter need of entertainment among men dulled and dazed by the routine of war, and encouraged variety shows organized by young officers who had been amateur actors before the war, who searched around for likely talent. There was plenty of it in the new army, including professional funny men, trick cyclists, conjurers, and singers of all kinds. So by the summer of 15 most of the divisions had their dramatic entertainments. The Follies, the Bow Bells, the Jocks, the Pip Squeaks, the Whiz Bangs, the Diamonds, the Brass Hats, the Very Lights, and many others with fancy names. I remember going to one of the first of them in the village of Achu, a few miles from the German lines. It was held in an old sugar factory, and I shall long remember the impressions of the place, with 700 or 800 men sitting in the gloom of that big, broken, barn-like building, where strange bits of machinery looked through the darkness, and where through gashes in the wall stars twinkled. There was a smell of clay and moist sugar and tarpaulins and damp khaki and chloride of lime, very pungent in one's nostrils, and when the curtain went up on a well-fitted stage and the Follies began their performance, the squalor of the place did not matter. What mattered was the enormous whimsicality of the bombardier at the piano and the outrageous comicality of a tousle-haired soldier with a red nose, who described how he had run away from Mons with the rest of you, and the light-heartedness of a performance which could have gone straight to a London music hall and brought down the house, with jokes and songs made up in dugouts and front-line trenches. At first the audience sat silent with glazed eyes. It was difficult to get a laugh out of them. The mud of the trenches was still on them. They stank of the trenches, and the stench was in their souls. Presently they began to brighten up. Life came back into their eyes. They laughed. Later, from this audience of soldiers, there were yells of laughter, though the effect of shells arriving at unexpected moments, in untoward circumstances, was a favorite theme of the jesters. Many of the men were going into the trenches that night again, and there would be no fun in the noise of the shells, but they went more gaily and with stronger hearts, I am sure, because of the laughter which had roared through the old sugar factory. A night or two later I went to another concert and heard the same gaiety of men who had been through a year of war. It was in an open field, under a velvety sky studded with innumerable stars. Nearly 1,000 soldiers trooped through the gates and massed before the little canvas theatre. In front a small crowd of Flemish children squatted on the grass, not understanding a word of the jokes, but laughing in shrill delight at the antics of soldier Pierrettes. The corner man was a funny fellow, and his by-play with a stout Flemish woman round the flap of the canvas screen, to whom he made amorous advances while his comrades were singing sentimental ballads, was truly comic. The hit of the evening was when an Australian behind the stage gave an unexpected imitation of a laughing jackass. There was something indescribably weird and wild and grotesque in that prolonged cry of cackling, unnatural mirth. An Australian by my side said, "Well done." "Exactly right." And the Flemish children shrieked with joy without understanding the meaning of the noise. Old songs belonging to the early Victorian age were given by the soldiers, who had great emotion and broke down sometimes in the middle of a verse. There were funny men dressed in the Widow Twankey style or in burlesque uniforms, who were greeted with yells of laughter by their comrades. An Australian giant played some clever card tricks, and another Australian recited Kipling's Gunga Din with splendid fire, and between every turn the soldiers in the field roared out a chorus. Jolly good song, jolly well sung. If you can think of a better, you're welcome to try. But don't forget the singer is dry, give the poor beggar some beer. A touring company of mouth organ musicians was having a great success in the war zone, but apart from all those organized methods of mirth, there was a funny man in every billet who played the part of court jester and clowned it whatever the state of the weather or the risks of war. The British soldier would have his game of house or crown and anchor, even on the edge of the shell storm, and his little bit of sport wherever there was room to stretch his legs. It was a jesting army, though some of its jokes were very grim, and those who saw, as I did, the daily tragedy of war, never ceasing, always adding to the sum of human suffering, were not likely to discourage that sense of humor. A successful concert with mouth organs, combs, and tissue paper and penny whistles was given by the guards in the front-line trenches near Loos. They played old English melodies, harmonized with great emotion and technical skill. It attracted an unexpected audience. The Germans crowded into their front line not far away and applauded each number. Presently, in good English, a German voice shouted across, "Play Annie Laurie, and I will sing it." The guards played Annie Laurie, and a German officer stood up on the parapet. The evening sun was red behind him, and sang the old song, admirably, with great tenderness. There was applause on both sides. "Let's have another concert tomorrow," shouted the Germans. But there was a different kind of concert next day, and the music was played by trench mortars, mills, bombs, rifle grenades, and other instruments of death in possession of the guards. There were cries of agony and terror from the German trenches, and young officers of the guards told the story as an amusing anecdote with loud laughter. Part 2, Chapter 16. It was astonishing how loudly one laughed at tales of gruesome things, of war's brutality, with the rest of them. I think at the bottom of it was a sense of the ironical contrast between the normal ways of civilian life and this hark back to the caveman code. It made all our old philosophy of life monstrously ridiculous. It played the hat trick with the gentility of modern manners. Men who had been brought up to Christian virtues, who had prattled their little prayers at mother's knees, who had grown up to a love of poetry, painting, music, the gentle arts, oversensitized to the subtleties of half-tones, delicate scales of emotion, fastidious in their choice of words, in their sense of beauty, found themselves compelled to live and act like ape men, and it was abominably funny. They laughed at the most frightful episodes, which revealed this contrast between civilized ethics and the old beast law. The more revolting it was, the more, sometimes, they shouted with laughter, especially in reminiscence, when the tale was told in the gilded salon of a French chateau, or at a mess table. It was, I think, the laughter of mortals at the trick which had been played on them by an ironical fate. They had been taught to believe that the whole object of life was to reach out to beauty and love, and that mankind, in its progress to perfection, had killed the beast instinct, cruelty, bloodlust, the primitive, savage law of survival by tooth and claw and club and axe. All poetry, all art, all religion had preached this gospel and this promise. Now that ideal had broken like a china vase dashed to hard ground. The contrast between that and this was devastating. It was, in an enormous world-shaking way, like a highly dignified man in a silk hat, morning coat, creased trousers, spats and patent boots, suddenly slipping on a piece of orange peel and sitting, all of a heap, with silk hat flying, in a filthy gutter. The wartime humor of the soul roared with mirth at the sight of all that dignity and elegance despoiled. So we laughed merrily, I remember, when a military chaplain, Eton, Christ Church, and Christian service, described how an English sergeant stood round the traverse of a German trench in a night raid, and as the Germans came his way, thinking to escape, he cleft one skull after another with a steel-studded bludgeon, a weapon which he had made with loving craftsmanship on the model of Blunderbore's club in the pictures of a fairy tale. So we laughed at the adventures of a young barrister, a brilliant fellow in the Oxford Union, whose pleasure it was to creep out o' nights into no man's land and lie doggo in a shell hole close to the enemy's barbed wire, until presently, after an hour's waiting or two, a German soldier would crawl out to fetch in a corpse. The English barrister lay with his rifle ready. Where there had been one corpse, there were two. Each night he made a notch on his rifle, 3 notches one night, to check the number of his victims. Then he came back to breakfast in his dugout with a hearty appetite. In one section of trenches the men made a habit of betting upon those who would be wounded first. It had all the uncertainty of the roulette table. One day, when the German gunners were putting over a special dose of hate, the sergeant kept coming to one dugout to inquire about a new chum who had come up with the drafts. "Is Private Smith all right?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant, he's all right," answered the men crouching in the dark hole. "Private Smith isn't wounded yet?" asked the sergeant again, 5 minutes later. No, Sergeant. Private Smith was touched by this interest in his well-being. That sergeant seems a very kind man, said the boy. Seems to love me like a father. A yell of laughter answered him. You poor, bleeding fool, said one of his comrades. He's drawn you in a lottery. Stood to win if you'd been hit. In digging new trenches and new dugouts, bodies and bits of bodies were unearthed and put into sandbags with the soil that was sent back down a line of men concealing their work from German eyes, waiting for any new activity in our ditches. Bit of Bill, said the leading man, putting in a leg. Another bit of Bill, he said, unearthing a hand. Bill's ugly mug, he said at a later stage in the operations when a head was found. As told afterward, that little episode in the trenches seemed immensely comic. Generals chuckled over it. Chaplains treasured it. How we used to guffaw at the answer of the Cockney soldier who met a German soldier with his hands up, crying, Kamerad, Kamerad, mercy. Not so much of your mercy, Kamerad, said the Cockney, and us over your bloody ticker. It was the man's watch he wanted, without sentiment. One tale was most popular, most mirth-arousing in the early days of the war. Where's your prisoner? Asked an intelligence officer waiting to receive a German sent down from the trenches under escort of an honest corporal. I lost him on the way, sir, said the corporal. Lost him. Lost him. The corporal was embarrassed. Very sorry, sir. My feelings overcame me, sir. It was like this, sir. The man started talking on the way down. Said he was thinking of his poor wife. I'd been thinking of mine, and I felt sorry for him. Then he mentioned as how he had 2 kiddies at home. I have 2 kiddies at home, sir, and I couldn't help feeling sorry for him. Then he said as how his old mother had died a while ago, and he'd never see her again. When he started crying, I was so sorry for him I couldn't stand it any longer, sir. So I killed the poor blighter. Our men in the trenches, and out of them, up to the waist in water sometimes, lying in slimy dugouts, lice-eaten, rat-haunted, on the edge of mine craters, under harassing fire, with just the fluke of luck between life and death, seized upon any kind of joke, as an excuse for laughter, and many a time in ruins and in trenches, and in dugouts I have heard great laughter. It was the protective armor of men's souls. They knew that if they did not laugh their courage would go and nothing would stand between them and fear. You know, sir, said a sergeant major one day, when I walked with him down a communication trench so waterlogged that my top boots were full of slime, it doesn't do to take this war seriously. And, as though in answer to him, a soldier without breeches and with his shirt tied between his legs looked at me and remarked, in a philosophical way, with just a glint of comedy in his eyes, that there grand fleet of ours don't seem to be very active, sir. It's a pity it don't come down these blinking trenches and do a bit of work. Having a clean up, my man, said a brigadier to a soldier trying to wash in a basin about the size of a kitchen mug. Yes, sir, said the man, and I wish I was a blasted canary. One of the most remarkable battles on the front was fought by a battalion of Worcestershires for the benefit of 2 English members of Parliament. It was not a very big battle, but most dramatic while it lasted. The colonel, who had a sense of humour, arranged it after a telephone message to his dugout telling him that 2 politicians were about to visit his battalion in the line, and asking him to show them something interesting. Interesting, said the colonel. Do they think this war is a peep show for politicians? Why do they want me to arrange a massacre to make a London holiday? Then his voice changed, and he laughed. Show them something interesting? Oh, all right, I dare say I can do that. He did. When the 2 M.P. arrived, apparently at the front-line trenches, they were informed by the colonel that, much to his regret, for their sake, the enemy was just attacking, and that his men were defending their position desperately. We hope for the best, he said, and I think there is just a chance that you will escape with your lives if you stay here quite quietly. Great God, said one of the M.P., and the other was silent but pale. Certainly there was all the noise of a big attack. The Worcesters were standing to on the fire step, firing rifle grenades and throwing bombs with terrific energy. Every now and then a man fell, and the stretcher-bearers pounced on him, tied him up in bandages, and carried him away to the field dressing station, whistling as they went, "We won't go home till morning," in a most heroic way. The battle lasted 20 minutes, at the end of which time the colonel announced to his visitors, "The attack is repulsed, and you, gentlemen, have nothing more to fear." One of the P. Dots was thrilled with excitement. "The valor of your men was marvelous," he said. "What impressed me most was the cheerfulness of the wounded. They were actually grinning as they came down on the stretchers." The colonel grinned, too. In fact, he stifled a fit of coughing. "Funny devils," he said. "They are so glad to be going home." The members of Parliament went away enormously impressed, but they had not enjoyed themselves nearly as well as the Worcesters, who had fought a sham battle, not in the front-line trenches, but in the support trenches 2 miles back. They laughed for a week afterward. Part 2, Chapter 17. On the hill at Wyzen, not far from the stately old town of St. Omer, visited from time to time by monstrous nightbirds who dropped high-explosive eggs, was a large convent. There were no nuns there, but generally some hundreds of young officers and men from many different battalions, attending a machine gun course under the direction of General Baker Carr, who was the master machine gunner of the British Army, at a time when we were very weak in those weapons compared with the enemy's strength, and a cheery, vital man. "This war has produced 2 great dugouts," said Lord Kitchener on a visit to the convent. "Me and Baker Carr. It was the boys who interested me more than the machines. I was never much interested in the machinery of war. They came down from the trenches to this school with a sense of escape from prison, and for the 10 days of their course they were like freshers at Oxford and made the most of their minutes, organizing concerts and other entertainments in the evenings after their initiation into the mysteries of Vickers and Lewis. I was invited to dinner there one night, and sat between 2 young cavalry officers on long benches crowded with subalterns of many regiments. It was a merry meal, and a good one to this day. I remember a potato pie, gloriously baked, and afterward, as it was the last night of the course, all the officers went wild and indulged in a rag of the public school kind. They straddled across the benches and barged at each other in single tourneys and jousts, riding their hobby horses with violent rearings and bruising one another without grievous hurt and with yells of laughter. Glasses broke, crockery crashed upon the polished boards. One boy danced the Highland fling on the tables, others were waltzing down the corridors. There was a rugby scrum in the refectory, and hunting men cried the view halloo, and shouted yoicks. Yoicks! General Baker Carr was a human soul, and kept to his own room that night and let discipline go hang. When the battles of the Somme began, it was those young officers who led their machine gun sections into the woods of Death, Belleville Wood, Mametz Wood, High Wood, and the others. It was they who afterward held the outpost lines in Flanders. Some of them were still alive on March 21st, 1918, when they were surrounded by a sea of Germans and fought, until the last, in isolated redoubts north and south of St. Quentin. 2 of them are still alive, those between whom I sat at dinner that night, and who escaped many close calls of death before the armistice. Of the others who charged one another with wooden benches, their laughter ringing out, some were blown to bits, and some were buried alive, and some were blinded and gassed, and some went missing forevermore. Part 2, Chapter 18. In those long days of trench warfare and stationary lines, it was boredom that was the worst malady of the mind, a large, overwhelming boredom to thousands of men who were in exile from the normal interests of life and from the activities of brain work, an intolerable, abominable boredom, sapping the willpower, the moral code, the intellect, a boredom from which there seemed no escape except by death, no relief except by vice, no probable or possible change in its dreary routine. It was bad enough in the trenches, where men looked across the parapet to the same corner of hell day by day, to the same dead bodies rotting by the edge of the same mine crater, to the same old sandbags in the enemy's line, to the blasted tree sliced by shell fire, the upturned railway truck of which only the metal remained, the distant fringe of trees like gallows on the skyline, the broken spire of a church which could be seen in the round-o of the telescope when the weather was not too misty. In quiet sections of the line, the only variation to the routine was the number of casualties day by casual shell fire or snipers' bullets, and that became part of the boredom. "What casualties?" asked the adjutant in his dugout. 2 killed, 3 wounded, sir." "Very well, you can go." A salute in the doorway of the dugout, a groan from the adjutant lighting another cigarette, leaning with his elbow on the deal table, staring at the guttering of the candle by his side, at the pile of forms in front of him, at the glint of light on the steel helmet hanging by its strap on a nail near the shelf where he kept his safety razor, flash lamp, love letters in an old cigar box, soap, whiskey bottle, almost empty now, and an unread novel. Hell, what a life. But there was always work to do, and odd incidents, and frights and responsibilities. It was worse, this boredom for men behind the lines, in lorry columns which went from railhead to dump every damned morning, and back again by the middle of the morning, and then nothing else to do for all the day, in a cramped little billet with a sulky woman in the kitchen, and squealing children in the yard, and a stench of manure through the small window. A dull life for an actor who had toured in England, America. Like one I met dazed and stupefied by years of boredom, paying too much for safety, or for a barrister who had many briefs before the war, and now found his memory going. Though a young man, because of the narrow limits of his life between one Flemish village and another, which was the length of his lorry column and of his adventure of war, nothing ever happened to break the monotony, not even shell fire. So it was also in small towns like Heston, St. Paul, Bruy, Lillers, 100 others, where officers stayed for years in charge of motor repair shops, ordnance stores, labor battalions, administration offices, claim commissions, graves, registration, agriculture for soldiers, all kinds of jobs connected with that life of war, but not exciting. Not exciting. So frightful in boredom that men were tempted to take to drink, to look around for unattached women, to gamble at cards with any poor devil like themselves. Those were most bored who were most virtuous. For them, with an ideal in their souls, there was no possibility of relief, for virtue is not its own reward, unless they were mystics, as some became, who found God good company and needed no other help. They had rare luck, those fellows with an astounding faith which rose above the irony and the brutality of that business being done in the trenches, but there were few of them. Even with hours of leisure, men who had been bookish could not read. That was a common phenomenon. I could read hardly at all. For years, and thousands were like me. The most exciting novel was dull stuff up against that world convulsion. What did the romance of love mean? The little tortures of one man's heart, or one woman's troubled in their mating, when thousands of men were being killed and vast populations were in agony. History, Greek or Roman or medieval, what was the use of reading that old stuff, now that world history was being made with a rush? Poetry, poor poets with their love of beauty. What did beauty matter, now that it lay dead in the soul of the world, under the filth of battlefields, and the dirt of hate and cruelty, and the law of the ape-like man? No, we could not read, but talked and talked about the old philosophy of life, and the structure of society, and democracy and liberty and patriotism and internationalism, and brotherhood of men, and God, and Christian ethics, and then talked no more, because all words were futile, and just brooded and brooded, after searching the daily paper, 2 days old, for any kind of hope and light, not finding either. Part 2, Chapter 19. At first, in the beginning of the war, our officers and men believed that it would have a quick ending. Our first expeditionary force came out to France with the cheerful shout of "Now we shall not be long," before they fell back from an advancing tide of Germans from Mons to the Marne, and fell in their youth like autumn leaves. The new army boys who followed them were desperate to get out to the great adventure. They cursed the length of their training in English camps. "We shan't get out till it's too late," they said. Too late, oh God. Even when they had had their first spell in the trenches and came up against German strength, they kept a queer faith, for a time, that something would happen to bring peace as quickly as war had come. Peace was always coming 3 months ahead. Generals and staff officers, as well as sergeants and privates, had that strong optimism, not based on any kind of reason, but gradually it died out, and in its place came the awful conviction, which settled upon the hearts of the fighting men, that this war would go on forever, that it was their doom always to live in ditches and dugouts, and that their only way of escape was by a blighty wound or by death. A chaplain I knew used to try to cheer up despondent boys by pretending to have special knowledge of inside politics. "I have it on good authority," he said, "that peace is near at hand. There have been negotiations in Paris. Or, I don't mind telling you lads that if you get through the next scrap you will have peace before you know where you are." They were not believing now. He had played that game too often. "Old stuff, Padre," they said. That particular crowd did not get through the next scrap, but the Padre's authority was good. They had peace long before the armistice. It was worst of all for boys of sensitive minds who were lucky enough to get a cushy wound, and so went on, or who were patched up again quickly after 1, 2, or 3 wounds, and came back again. It was a boy like that who revealed his bitterness to me one day as we stood together in the salient. "It's the length of the war," he said, "which does one down. At first it seemed like a big adventure, and the excitement of it, horrible though it was, kept one going. Even the first time I went over the top wasn't so bad as I thought it would be. I was dazed and drunk with all sorts of emotions, including fear, that were worse before going over. I had what we call the needle. They all have it. Afterward one didn't know what one was doing, even the killing part of the business, until one reached the objective and lay down, and had time to think and to count the dead about. Now the excitement has gone out of it, and the war looks as though it would go on forever. At first we all searched the papers for some hope that the end was near. We don't do that now. We know that whenever the war ends, this year or next, this little crowd will be mostly wiped out. Bound to be. And why are we going to die? That's what all of us want to know. What's it all about? Oh yes, I know the usual answers. In defense of liberty, to save the empire. But we've all lost our liberty. We're slaves under shell fire. And as for the empire, I don't give a curse for it. I'm thinking only of my little home at Streatham Hill. The horrible Hun? I've no quarrel with the poor blighters over there by Hooge. They are in the same bloody mess as we are. They hate it just as much. We're all under a spell together, which some devils have put on us. I wonder if there's a God anywhere. This sense of being under a black spell I found expressed by other men, and by German prisoners who used the same phrase. I remember one of them in the battles of the Somme, who said, in good English, this war was not made in any sense by mankind. We are under a spell. This belief was due, I think, to the impersonal character of modern warfare, in which gunfire is at so long a range that shell fire has the quality of natural and elemental powers of death like thunderbolts, and men killed 20 miles behind the lines while walking over sunny fields or in busy villages had no thought of a human enemy desiring their individual death. God and Christianity raised perplexities in the minds of simple lads desiring life and not death. They could not reconcile the Christian precepts of the chaplain with the bayoneting of Germans and the shambles of the battlefields. All this blood and mangled flesh in the fields of France and Flanders seemed to them, to many of them, I know, a certain proof that God did not exist, or if he did exist was not, as they were told, a God of love, but a monster glad of the agonies of men. That at least was the thought expressed to me by some London lads who argued the matter with me one day, and that was the thought which our army chaplains had to meet from men who would not be put off by conventional words. It was not good enough to tell them that the Germans were guilty of all this crime, and that unless the Germans were beaten the world would lose its liberty and life. Yes, we know all that, they said, but why did God allow the Germans, or the statesmen who arranged the world by force, or the clergy who christened British warships? And how is it that both sides pray to the same God for victory? There must be something wrong somewhere. It was not often men talked like that, except to some chaplain who was a human, comradely soul, some Catholic padre who devoted himself fearlessly to their bodily and spiritual needs, risking his life with them, or to some Presbyterian minister who brought them hot cocoa under shell fire, with a cheery word or two, as I once heard, of "Keep your hearts up, my lads, and your heads down." Most of the men became fatalists, with odd superstitions in the place of faith. It's no good worrying, they said. If your name is written on a German shell, you can't escape it, and if it isn't written, nothing can touch you. Officers as well as men had this fatalistic belief and superstitions which amused them and helped them. Have the Huns found you out yet? I asked some gunner officers in a ruined farmhouse near Kemmel Hill. Not yet, said one of them. And then they all left the table at which we were at lunch, and making a rush for some oak beams, embraced them ardently. They were touching wood. Take this with you, said an Irish officer, on a night I went to Ypres. It will help you as it has helped me. It's my lucky charm. He gave me a little bit of coal which he carried in his tunic, and he was so earnest about it that I took it without a smile and felt the safer for it. Once in a while the men went home on 7 days' leave or 4 and then came back again, gloomily, with a curious kind of hatred of England, because the people there seemed so callous to their suffering, so utterly without understanding, so damned cheerful. They hated the smiling women in the streets. They loathed the old men who said, "If I had 6 sons I would sacrifice them all in the sacred cause." They desired that profiteers should die by poison gas. They prayed God to get the Germans to send Zeppelins to England to make the people know what war meant. Their leave had done them no good at all. From a weekend at home, I stood among a number of soldiers who were going back to the front after one of those leaves. The boat warped away from the pier, the MTO, and a small group of officers, detectives, and Red Cross men disappeared behind an empty train, and the revenants on deck stared back at the cliffs of England across a widening strip of sea. "Back to the bloody old trenches," said a voice, and the words ended with a hard laugh. They were spoken by a young officer of the Guards, whom I had seen on the platform of Victoria saying goodbye to a pretty woman who had put her hand on his shoulder for a moment and said, "Do be careful, Desmond, for my sake." Afterward he had sat in the corner of his carriage, staring with a fixed gaze at the rushing countryside, but seeing nothing of it. Perhaps, as his thoughts travelled backward, a few days later he was blown to bits by a bomb, an accident of war. A little man on deck came up to me and said, in a melancholy way, "You know who I am, don't you, sir?" I hadn't the least idea who he was, this little ginger-haired soldier with a wizened and wistful face. But I saw that he wore the claret-coloured ribbon of the V.C. on his khaki tunic. He gave me his name and said the papers had done him proud, and that they had made a lot of him at home presentations, receptions, speeches, Lord Mayor's addresses, cheering crowds, and all that. He was one of our heroes, though one couldn't tell it by the look of him. "Now I'm going back to the trenches," he said, gloomily. Same old business and one of the crowd again. He was suffering from the reaction of popular idolatry. He felt hipped because no one made a fuss of him now or bothered about his claret-coloured ribbon. The staff officers, chaplains, brigade majors, regimental officers, and army nurses were more interested in an airship, a silver fish with shining gills, and a humming song in its stomach. France, and the beginning of what the little V.C. had called the same old business. There was the long fleet of motor ambulances, as a reminder of the ultimate business of all those young men in khaki, whom I had seen drilling in the embankment gardens and shouldering their way down the Strand. Some stretchers were being carried to the lift, which goes down to the deck of the hospital ship, on which an officer was ticking off each wounded body after a glance at the label tied to the man's tunic. Several young officers lay under the blankets on those stretchers, and one of them caught my eye and smiled as I looked down upon him. The same old business and the same old pluck. I motored down the long, straight roads of France eastward, toward that network of lines which are the end of all journeys after a few days' leave, home and back again. The same old sights and sounds and smells which, as long as memory lasts, to men who had the luck to live through the war, will haunt them for the rest of life, and to speak of Flanders. The harvest was nearly gathered in, and where, a week or two before, there had been fields of high, bronzed corn, there were now long stretches of stubbled ground waiting for the plough. The wheat sheaves had been piled into stacks, or, from many great fields, carted away to the red-roofed barns below the black old windmills, whose sails were motionless because no breath of air stirred on this September afternoon. The smell of Flemish villages, a mingled ode of sun-baked thatch and bakeries and manure heaps and cows and ancient vapours stored up through the centuries, was overborne by a new and more pungent aroma which crept over the fields with the evening haze. It was a sad, melancholy smell, telling of corruption and death. It was the first breath of autumn, and I shivered a little. Must there be another winter of war? The old misery of darkness and dampness was creeping up through the splendour of September sunshine. Those soldiers did not seem to smell it, or, if their nostrils were keen, to mind its menace, those soldiers who came marching down the road, with tanned faces. How fine they looked, and how hard, and how cheerful with their lot. Speak to them separately and every man would grouse at the duration of the war and swear that he was fed up with it. Homesickness assailed them at times with a deadly nostalgia. The hammering of shell fire, which takes its daily toll, spoiled their temper and shook their nerves, as far as a British soldier had any nerves, which I used to sometimes doubt, until I saw again the shell shock cases. But again I heard their laughter, and an old song whistled veerly out of tune, but cheerful to the tramp of their feet. They were going back to the trenches after a spell in a rest camp, to the same old business of whiz-bangs and pip-squeaks, and dugouts, and the smell of wet clay and chloride of lime, and the life of earth men who once belonged to a civilization which had passed, and they went whistling on their way, because it was the very best thing to do. One picked up the old landmarks again and got back into the feel of the war zone. There were the 5 old windmills of Cassel that waved their arms up the hill road, and the estaminets by which one found one's way down country lanes, the veritable cuckoo, and the lost corner, and the flower of the fields, and the first smashed roofs and broken barns, which led to the area of constant shell fire. So it was still going on, this bloody murder. There were some more cottages down in the village where we had tea a month before, and in the marketplace of a sleepy old town the windows were mostly broken, and some shops had gone into dust and ashes. That was new since we last passed this way. London was only 7 hours away, but the hours on leave there seemed a year ago already. The men who had come back, after sleeping in civilization with a blessed sense of safety, had a few minutes of queer surprise that, after all, this business of war was something more real than a fantastic nightmare, and then put on their moral cloaks against the chill and grim reality for another long spell of it. Very quickly the familiarity of it all came back to them and became the normal instead of the abnormal. They were back again to the settled state of war, as boys go back to public schools after the wrench from home, and find that the holiday is only the incident, and school the more enduring experience. There were no new impressions, only the repetition of old impressions. So I found when I heard the guns again, and watched the shells bursting about Ypres and over Kemmel Ridge and Messines Church Tower. 2 German airplanes passed overhead, and the hum of their engines was loud in my ears as I lay in the grass. Our shrapnel burst about them, but did not touch their wings. All around there was the slamming of great guns, and I sat chewing a bit of straw by the side of a shell hole, thinking in the same old way of the utter senselessness of all this noise and hate and sudden death which encircled me for miles. No amount of meditation would screw a new meaning out of it all. It was just the commonplace of life out here. The routine of it went on. The officer who came back from home stepped into his old place, and after the first greeting of, "Hello, old man," had a good time. Found his old job waiting for him. So there was a new brigadier general. Quick promotion, by Jove. 4 men had got knocked out that morning at D4, and it was rotten bad luck that the sergeant major should have been among them. A real good fellow. However, there's that court-martial for this afternoon, and, by the by, when is that timber coming up? I can't build the new dugout if there's no decent wood to be got by stealing or otherwise. You heard how the men got strafed in their billets the other day? Dirty work. The man who had come back went into the trenches and had a word or two with the N.C.O. Then he went into his own dugout. The mice had been getting at his papers. Oh yes, that's where he left his pipe. It was lying under the trestle table, just where he dropped it before going on leave. The clay walls were a bit wet after the rains. He stood with a chilled feeling in this little hole of his, staring at every familiar thing in it. Tacked to the wall was the portrait of a woman. He said goodbye to her at Victoria Station. How long ago? Surely more than 7 hours or 7 years. Outside there were the old noises. The guns were at it again. That was a trench mortar. The enemy's 8-inch howitzers were plugging away. What a beastly row that machine gun was making. Playing on the same old spot. Why couldn't they leave it alone, the asses? Anyhow, there was no doubt about it, he had come back again. Back to the trenches and the same old business. There was a mine to be blown up that night, and it would make a pretty mess in the enemy's lines. The colonel was very cheerful about it, and explained that a good deal of sapping had been done. "We've got the bulge on 'em," he said, referring to the enemy's failures in this class of work. In the mess all the officers were carrying on as usual, making the same old jokes. The man who had come back got back also the spirit of the thing with astonishing rapidity. That other life of his, away there in old London, was shut up in the cupboard of his heart. So it went on, and on until the torture of its boredom was broken by the crash of big battles, and the new armies which had been learning lessons in the school of courage, went forward to the great test, and passed with honor.
This concludes the 5th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.